And investors seem to be brushing off the recent drama in Washington. Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist, joins us exclusively on What You Missed for the next hour to give us his insights on the economy, the legislative agenda, and more.
President Donald Trump is looking for unity on tax reform. Earlier today, he said that he would be making some changes to the framework that was originally unveiled last month. The announcement comes as key senators raise concerns with the specifics of the plan, which includes eliminating the state and local tax deduction. Let's bring in Paul Krugman. He's Nobel Prize-winning economist, a columnist for the New York Times, and a professor at the City University of New York. Professor Krugman, it's an honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Great to be on.
Prospects for tax reform from this administration?
Well, I'm not a legislative expert. I mean, intellectually, it's completely incoherent. They seem to have lost the thread on what it is they're trying to do. They have no way to actually accomplish, anything that looks remotely like deficit neutrality without actually sharply raising taxes on a lot of middle-class people. So it's a mess. Now, that wouldn't be the first time that something that was a mess made it through Congress, but it's not looking very good.
When you say that it's completely incoherent, what do you mean by that? When you look at the range of policies, what stands out to you as not making any sense?
Well, first of all, they keep on saying Americans are overtaxed. We're the highest taxed country in the, that's a lie. We're just about the lowest taxed among major countries, but still they keep on implying that they're going to do a tax cut for middle income people. They keep on saying, well, we're not going, we're responsible fiscally, and yet there's no way you can have what they really, really want, which is a huge tax cut for businesses, this pass-through thing, which would be a huge tax cut for people with high incomes, without somehow or other raising taxes on a lot of people to pay for it. So they haven't figured out a way to make the thing hang together at all.
And don't forget the middle-class tax cut that they've been promising as well.
Well, there is no middle-class tax cut in there. In fact, there's a substantial middle-class, random pieces of the middle-class tax increase in everything we've seen so far. So, yeah, they had a couple of ways they thought they were going to be able to pay for it. One of which involved, repealing the Affordable Care Act. The other of which involved the border tax adjustment. Since both of those have died, now they have absolutely no idea how to make the arithmetic work.
You just push back on the idea that the United States is one of the highest tax. You said actually it's one of the lowest.
Yeah. If you just take taxes as a share of GDP, then among advanced countries, we're right at the bottom. Now, and now you can try to make some excuses. We have a relatively high, top-line corporate tax rate.
Yes.
But on the other hand, we have lots and lots of deductions and so on. So our effective corporate tax rate is only sort of normal, and our individual taxes are definitely low. So it's amazing that Trump just repeats this again and again, and it's as flatly false as anything there is in the world.
On the corporate tax side, leaving aside the individual taxes for the moment, on the corporate tax side, are there ways that you think that taxes could be reformed in a productive way that would make things more efficient, more logical?
Well, it's actually kind of funny, the reform that Paul Ryan originally floated early this year, the destination-based cash flow tax, which included the border tax adjustment, was a not stupid idea. It has kind of bipartisan support among tax experts. People like Alan Auerbach were saying this is a good idea. I support. So, and of course, it being the one thing that I've seen from Paul Ryan that was really not a terrible idea, it died instantly in the political arena. And you can't, without that, without the border tax adjustment that's the piece of that, there's no way to make a significant corporate, cut in corporate marginal tax rates that doesn't explode the deficit.
Can I ask you about Art Laffer and the Laffer curve and the implications for Kansas and what happened there? Yeah. Is that a specific example of where something didn't go wrong because they made mistakes, or does that theory has been blown out of the water by the example there?
Oh, it's been blown out of the water by every single example we've seen, right? There's been not a single case where anything like the Laffer curve has seemed to be true. It was Kansas. A state level is actually an especially favorable case for it because capital labor can easily flow into a state. So the chances that cutting taxes might actually increase revenue is much higher at the level of one state than it is for the United States as a whole. And even so, all it did in Kansas was create a fiscal crisis. And nothing, look, the Clinton tax hike was supposed to destroy the economy. Instead, we had the best boom, of the post-war era. Obama substantially increased taxes in 2013. Nothing terrible happened. So this is, there is nothing supporting this point of view except the fact that some very rich people would like it to be true.
So based on all that, we don't really understand the impact of tax cuts in aggregate. Is that a fair argument to make, a fair point to make?
Well, there is very little reason to think that tax cuts matter much one way or the other for underlying growth. I mean, basically what happens if you cut taxes is you cut tax collection. That's basically what happens.
But if you're arguing in this case that actually a lot of the financing is going to be provided by higher growth as a result of the tax cuts.
You might as well just assume that unicorns will come and deliver packages of money, right? There's no reason to believe this.
Okay.
I need to ask you about health care because the president says he plans to sign executive action to allow new health plans outside of Obamacare, creating more health care options for people. That's his sell. Now, experts say this would destabilize already fragile markets. So what happens in the interim? Because whatever plan he does open this up to wouldn't take effect right away.
Yeah, the thing, however, is that insurers have to make decisions about whether to participate in the market. They have to submit requests for premiums. So all of this uncertainty is wreaking huge damage already. So I mean, premiums are going way up for 2018, and most of that is because of the Trump administration and the uncertainty it's created.
So can it survive until 2019?
Well, yes, because most people, even in the individual market, most people are receiving subsidies, which cushion them from the increases. And then there's Medicaid, which is unaffected by all of this. So it gets worse, but it doesn't collapse.
Concerned that the search for the next Fed chair may take a political turn. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman wrote in his column last week, surely it's possible, even probable, that the Federal Reserve, like other government agencies, is about to get Trumpified, that one of American policy's last remaining havens of competence and expertise will soon share in the general degradation. What's an example of a Trumpified Fed pick versus one that showcases the Fed's competence and expertise?
Well, there's a very clear dichotomy here, right? We have a perfectly fine Fed chair who could be reappointed. Janet Yellen has, by every indicator, done a stellar job. Why not just keep her? On the other hand, for a while there, the betting was kind of, the prediction markets were thinking that the most likely pick was Kevin Warsh, former Fed governor who there's a lot of things you can say about them, but one thing is he does have a track record over the past decade, and it's quite consistent. He's been wrong about everything.
Economic forecasts, worried about inflation as the world was sliding into depression, worried that terrible things, thought that fiscal policy was going to be, thought that we were going to turn into Greece. It's amazing. It's kind of almost awesome. I mean, you can almost make money by taking whatever he thinks is going to happen and betting the other way. But politically correct from the Republican point of view, has some family connections with Trump. So that would have been, and it might still be appointed, although apparently his stock has declined a little bit.
How much do you weigh concern of what you would see as a bad pick, and obviously it sounds like you don't think Kevin Warsh would be a good pick, a bad pick versus a pick who is perceived to be at Trump's beck and call, and so Trump calling him or her out on Twitter for a rate hike, stuff like that. Which of those would concern you more?
Well, both. I mean, in some ways, I think those go together. I don't think they're really separate, because you had somebody who was actually good and respected within the Fed and respects the institution of the Fed. That person is also not going to be particularly pressurable by the White House. So if you had somebody who had no real reason for being there except the fact that Trump decided that he liked him or her, although it's going to be a him if that's who it is, then that would be the kind of person you would worry about being politicized.
We've seen U-turns on many occasions from Donald Trump. Do you think there's a chance here that his criticism of Janet Yellen was made perhaps before he'd spoken to people who may have known more about monetary policy, and actually having learnt subsequently, he's perhaps realizing that continuity at the Fed might not be a bad thing and actually reappoints Janet Yellen at the end?
Well, I'm hoping so. I mean, that would be the best outcome, I think, given what's happening right now.
But you don't think it's highly likely?
His U-turns then tend to be followed by further U-turns. Every time you think he's reached a reasonable agreement on something, then he finds a way to go back on it. So I worry about that even here.
Even now.
Speaking of Janet Yellen, and speaking, getting away from the question of who the next Fed chair is going to be, one of the most notable things going on in the economy is the persistent failure of the Fed or the economy overall to get to 2% inflation, to hit the inflation goals.
Right.
In light of what we've seen over the last several years, all the things that have tried, have you changed or evolved in your thinking of what the Fed can do to hit inflation? What have you learned about the Fed and inflation by watching this persistent shortfall?
Okay, there's two different things. One is monetary policy just doesn't have that much traction when interest rates are very low. That still remains true, and even though the Fed has, normalized a little bit, we're still kind of in that regime where the Fed, all the attention's on the Fed, and yet the Fed has much less power than it would in what we used to think of as normal times. The other thing is there's something going on the inflation process. It looks as if, whether it's that the natural rate of unemployment, if such a thing exists, is way down, or the Phillips curve has gotten flatter, or there's downward nominal rate rigidity, or something, but something clearly, the underlying models we were using to try to predict inflation, which were never very good, are now looking completely
Do you
useless.
have a favorite theory or explanation for what that something is?
I think it's a mix of there still being pent-up wage cuts that don't want to happen, and there's still an overhang from the past. And I think there's nervousness. I think that people, having been through the Great Recession and the long, slow recovery, are just very reluctant to grant or demand wage increases that might end up being locked in during the next slump.
So does that mean that the Federal Reserve should rethink its approach to targeting 2% inflation? Should it give up that target?
Oh, no, on the contrary. I mean, everything we've seen that says that 2% inflation is, if anything, too low. That given that we've seen how hard it is to get inflation up once it's too low, given that it really looks like, I'm a secular stagnation guy, that we really need to have the opportunity of having significantly negative real interest rates, that the Fed's target should be above 2%.
What,
now,
3%?
Well, I would. I remember, I'm old enough, I'm older than all you guys. I remember a 4%. I remember Reagan's second term when we had 4% inflation, and it wasn't so bad, and it gave you a lot more room for monetary policy. So I would go there. Now, it's a long way from being politically acceptable, but no, by no means. But by no means to say that because we're having trouble getting to the 2% target, which actually looks too low, that we should give up on even trying to get there.
Should the Fed be not hiking right now? If you were Fed chair, would you not be?
I would not be hiking right now. I think the Fed is trying to normalize, and that version of normality went out the window 10 years ago.
Republican Senator Bob Corker is in open opposition to the president, calling the White House, quote, an adult daycare center, and worrying whether President Trump can lead the nation to a third world war, or whether he would. But perhaps the real battle is within the Republican Party itself. We're back with Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize-winning economist.
Paul, one of the interesting things about Corker's comments is he said, there are a lot of people within my caucus who feel the same way I do. But of course, none of them have really called out Trump to the same degree. What do you think the reluctance is all about?
It's about their political careers. I mean, I've been paying attention to this stuff for a long time, and I read a lot. Today's Republican legislators, people in the Senate and even more so in the House, they grew up in an era of a monolithic, very tightly organized Republican Party. These are not people who courageously staked out a position that might have been unpopular. These are people who joined a political machine that guaranteed them a good living, even if they lost an election, right? They'd say, we call it wingnut welfare, all of that, right? And so they are not, these are apparatchiks. These are not people who are going to step out and take a stand on principle. It's not the kind of people they are. It would require a lot. Now, Corker turns out to be a more interesting guy than we thought, but it's also he's decided that his political career is over. There are going to be very few who are willing to do that, even under the most extreme circumstances.
But you've got now Senator John McCain, of course, as well, who's having treatment for brain cancer. You've got Bob Corker. So you've got two kind of stalwarts in the party. So people
who are on the edge of retirement or possibly don't have very long to live are willing to say something. That I don't think is going to be enough to be an effectively large caucus.
But in terms of trying to get legislation through, losing two big senators like that actually is critical for the GOP.
Well, that's right. And remember, we already saw Obamacare repeal, crash and burn.
Yes.
Tax reform, whatever it is they're trying to do on taxes, is in big trouble. So it's quite possible that they'll have a completely sterile legislative agenda, and which, from my point of view, is a good thing. But in any case, yes, they don't have the kind of margin that would allow them to push stuff through if they have even a few people who've decided, oh, the hell with it, I'm just going to say what I think.
Well, the party's in a little bit of a dilemma here because they've rallied around principles that seem to be in opposition to themselves. For instance, they want tax cuts on investment income to boost the economy. They want tax cuts for the middle class, all the while avoiding widening the budget deficit. You can't have one without the other. And
right.
Something's got to give, and no one's willing to concede any of that.
Yeah, we have a phrase it's in other circumstances, but it works in international economics. We talk about the impossible trinity. There are three different things that everybody wants, and you can only have two of them. And they've definitely got themselves in the impossible trinity. And they also have the problem, which is that Trump sold himself to his base as a populist. I'm going to help you against the swamp and against the big guys. And then everything that they're trying to do legislatively is standard Republican, let's give more to the oligarchy.
How do you think that tension is going to resolve ultimately? Because it does seem like there's, the McConnell wing and the Trump wing are distinct, especially in how they see the economy and populism, taxes perhaps. Ultimately, do you think the old McConnell wing will just completely be swept out?
Oh, no, if you actually look at concrete legislative measures, look at what Trump has actually proposed or at least signed on to, first on health care, now on taxes, it's totally the McConnell-Ryan wing. There's been no hint at all of that economic populism in anything he actually does. He talks a populist game, but in fact his populism never translates into economics. He's populist on race relations, he's populist on cultural war, but on economics there's been no, it appears to be entirely just rhetoric.
But so far he hasn't got anything done. So if he actually tries to get legislation passed, he called Chuck Schumer apparently on Friday to try and get something done on healthcare. The risk is that perhaps he tries to see what he can get away with on tax cuts, if not tax reform. Does the sort of bipartisan outreach become the end game here if he wants to get things done? Because he's a deal maker, isn't he? He wants action, results.
The thing about him as a deal maker, though, is that he tends to renege on all his deals. Right? They thought they had a deal on the Dreamers. He now suddenly is, going
now they're outraged
on that. He said, "I'm willing to deal on health care," but now he seems to be imposing other conditions. So, who's going to make a deal with him now, really?
So what should the Democrats do during this time where they may possibly be working with the president on some kind of deal, even though they're not confident it's going to come to fruition? Because they themselves are at risk of fracturing or splintering into an extreme left and a shrinking moderate presence.
I think that's much exaggerated. If you look on policy substance, there's really not a whole lot of division. We talk about different wings of the Democratic Party, but in fact the whole party is pretty much unified in anything that involves policy in the medium term.
Well, right now they're unified against Donald Trump.
And they're also unified for, we're going to defend Obamacare. Maybe we'd like single payer eventually, but even if you look at the standard single payer plan, most of it is a transition to a public option. So I think there's much less real division there. I think what the Democrats probably do is they sound flexible, they talk with Trump, they make it clear we're willing to talk with Trump, but they don't actually offer him anything much because why? They know that they'll get shafted if they do, and they know that the base will be angry with them if they do.
Paul, you made the call that markets would tank if President Trump got elected.
I retracted it very soon afterwards, and I did what you should never ever do, which is to let your political biases interfere with your judgment. I thought this is a terrible thing, which it was, but it isn't necessarily going to be terrible for every indicator. And so it was.
So this is a mea culpa.
This is a mea culpa. I did a mea culpa.
I did
already.
That.
I've done that already.
Yeah,
no,
you did.
This was me doing exactly what I tell people not to do, and it's going to happen. We're all mortal. One thing is worth saying, by the way. We talk about there's a Trump bump. There's also a Merkel bump, a Macron bump, a May bump, an Abe bump. Stock markets have been up all around the world, so something's going on. People like stocks, and why do they? What is the? God knows. I always quote my old teacher, Paul Samuelson, who said that the stock market had predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. The market may not be telling us much of anything at all, except that for some reason people are liking stocks.
We had a viewer question, actually, and I think you've kind of already answered it there, asking whether the Trump stock bump reflects a fundamental change to the economy or just the expectation that business owners will eat a larger piece of the pie, with employees and the public at large eating less pie and more externalities like dirty air and water.
Yeah, or it might just reflect the fact that investors think that other investors are going to pay more for stocks. I mean, it really doesn't have to mean anything much at all. Let me say so. I am a little surprised that the market doesn't worry more about the downside of a totally catastrophic response if something bad happens. What if we have something really bad happens and they handle everything the way they handled Puerto Rico? That ought to be some kind of weight on the market, but we know that markets tend tend to ignore those things until they actually do happen.
I wanted to play for you a comment from Richard Thaler, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, on what he thinks about what's going on in the stock market. Take a listen.
Curious.
I don't know about you, but I'm nervous. And it seems like when investors are nervous, they're prone to being spooked. And nothing seems to spook the market. As you said, it just crawls up slowly but surely. And if it's all based on the expectation of some big tax cut, surely investors should have lost confidence that was going to happen, given what's happened so far out of Congress.
Especially what we've heard of late, Joe, which is that the president's going back to tweak the tax proposal.
Right, so there's all this uncertainty, as you said, like we've seen an example of disaster response in action. It hasn't been impressive. There's active saber rattling about North Korea now almost every other day. Threat of armed military conflict. So is your theory that basically markets are not really good forward discounters and basically just take into account what already happened?
Yeah, it's not, isn't even really a theory, that's an observation. We know that. And some of us, again, remember the housing bubble. And that was the clearest thing I'd ever seen in my life. That was just overwhelming the numbers, and yet month after month the prices kept on rising, and people kept saying, "Oh, if there were really a bubble, surely it would have burst by now." And then one day it did.
Do you see a bubble right now?
It's much less clear. Let's put this: profits are high, interest rates are still very low, so it makes kind of sense for stock prices to be high given that. It's more, in this case, I don't see it's a really overwhelming bubble. I just think that there's a disaster risk that the markets are not taking into account.
When we ask people about this, though, they say, look, for the first time in 2 decades, maybe more, we've got this synchronous growth pattern when they look around the world, and actually that lifts all boats. Do you buy that?
Well, not necessarily, because sometimes a synchronous growth pattern means that interest rates rise, which tend to, and that's not happening. So I don't, look, at some level, look, Bob Shiller famously, he did a study during the '87 stock crash, and he asked people, why are you selling in real time? Using fax machines, because that's all you had at the time. And the only answer that appeared with any frequency, there were all kinds of ex post rationalizations. The only answer was, I'm selling because prices are falling. I think people are buying stocks because prices are rising, and I think that's all.
Now, in terms of the economy, I wanted to get your sense of the labor market, because you can't really read too much in the latest jobs report, yet people were saying, oh, look at the participation rate, it's gone up. Look at earnings, it's gone up. What do you take away from the latest couple of reports and what it says about the economy?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time figuring out what lately I've been looking at the quits rate, which is back up to normal levels. And that it seems to be signaling that we really are people seem to feel that it's okay to leave a job because they can find another one, which suggests that we are kind of at full employment. Now, the earnings are not really showing that. Wage increases are still subpar, but maybe, and also it's interesting that prime age labor force participation is creeping back up to previous levels. So all the people who said this is structural, it really is nothing, turns out no, it's just lack of jobs. So really so there's some actual good stuff, and I wouldn't take 1 month's number on the NFP very much.
And we turn our focus to urban policy and infrastructure. Professor, you've written about the flooding disaster that was caused by Hurricane Harvey in Houston and how it's largely due to bad policy, including unregulated development. Some estimates have the storm causing up to $200 billion in damage. So what's the lesson here? What should be done differently?
Well, in Houston, it's pretty clear. People have been warning about this for a long time. That essentially, it's too much of it is paved. You need to have places to drain. You need to have, you cannot just in what is very much a place that nature wants to flood occasionally, even leaving aside climate change that wants to happen, and even more so now. If you have completely unregulated development, then you end up with no place for water to go. Now, the funny thing is, the thing that makes it agonizing is, on the other hand, in some ways, Houston does it right by not restricting development in ways that prevent people from building housing. So you have a kind of extreme San Francisco style, which is NIMBYism gone wild, which is disastrous, and Houston it has much cheaper housing because it didn't do that. On the other hand, you have complete, ignoring the environmental consequences of unrestricted development, and we seem to find it very hard politically to find the balance there.
Right. I was just, if you look at all the other boom cities over the last decade, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, completely unaffordable for home ownership for the middle class. Right. Houston has been a success story on this front. A thriving city economically where middle class people can afford to buy.
That's right. No, if you look at, when we ask why does Texas grow faster in general than the rest of the country, it's none of the things that the Texans like to boast about. It's not because of low taxes. It's not because they're cruel to the poor. It's because they have a housing policy that lets you build houses, which the Northeast and even worse, the far West do not have. So that's a good thing, but you have to have some place for the water to go when there's a hurricane, and they haven't done that. So it's a real no one seems to. I mean, the only city that seems to have adequate regulation, big city, and affordable housing is Chicago. Unfortunately, they've also got Chicago winters, so I don't know what you do about that.
And the crime rate, but
well. Can you steal something from them in terms of the way they've tackled this? Because, as you say, it's kind of bad city planning, the zoning laws, and we've talked about them on the show before in Houston, also a huge problem. But then you compare it to San Francisco as well and say, actually, look at the situation that they've created where people have extreme commuting, which actually I'd never even heard about.
Well, we have some of that here. I know a couple of people who live in Bucks County and commute to Manhattan. So
how long does that take?
About 2 hours.
Wow. But you used an example of 4 hours in that's...
No, and it's, the thing is, technically there are no problems. We know how to do this. We know what should be done. It's easy to draw up a list. The question is how... Politics. And I don't know if we found a way to make that happen. It just seems to be, de Blasio came in with very good ideas about trying to expand affordable housing, and he's done what in absolute terms is quite a lot in New York, but of course it's such a huge city that it's just a drop in the bucket relative to the size of the problem.
How much are we going to rely on local politicians, city mayors, state governors to do a lot of the work here because everything's so gummed up at the federal level? Well,
first of all, this is going to have to be local policy in any case. And sure, it is going to require local politicians. The trouble, when people talk about decentralization, the fact of the matter is, by and large, with honorable exceptions, but a lot of local politicians are really pretty terrible, right? not that many people vote in state and local elections, and so you often, you have machine politicians. You have
You're not getting the best people.
On the whole, even much as as I can denounce stuff that goes on in Congress, I'm not sure that there are many state legislatures that I would prefer.
Is there something here in New York City, when you look at regulations of the housing market, that you think could be done that a mayor or the city council could do to ease housing prices?
Oh, sure. Even though we're an enormous city and very dense, there's still lots of potential building. There's lots of places where we could still build up. There's still, in fact, land that is unbuilt that could be built without destroying the quality of life. If you're going to have a city, a metro area with 20+ million people, you're going to have some really dense developments. And look, I actually checked. My zip code has got about 70,000 people per square mile. And it doesn't feel impossibly overcrowded. It's high-rise-ish. You can live that way, and we need more of that.
Paul, let's talk about Spain to start off with. What do you think here?
Well, not at all familiar. I mean, I don't know Spain. I certainly don't know Catalonia. I mean, it's odd to have this timing. I mean, if you were thinking that there were bad things were going to happen in Spain, you would have expected those 3 or 4 years ago when the Spanish economy was really in the dumps. And that Spain is actually making a comeback, and a fair bit of that actually in Catalonia. But they're having the auto industry is coming back. Spain is, it's an incredibly expensive process of internal devaluation. But they have finally been, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. So it's kind of odd to have this happening now. Now I understand, Catalonia has in fact been deeply oppressed culturally. But you try to think about what it would mean to break Catalonia away from the rest of Spain now, and my God, it's like trying to imagine Virginia seceding again now, right? It would be a really impossible thing to happen.
But when you look at Europe optically, I mean, we've had the Macron victory over in France. Angela Merkel just come back in Germany. Yes, we've got these hot spots like Italy, and we've got the tensions now in Spain. But overall, what's your sense of Europe at this moment?
Well, Europe, the euro continues to function badly, right? The euro was a mistake. It has been a big constraint. They paid a huge price in high unemployment. But the political cohesiveness of Europe, with the exception of Britain, has turned out to be much stronger. I mean, us Anglo-Saxons didn't quite understand just how deep the commitment of much of the European elite was to it.
In 10 years, will all the countries that are in the Eurozone still be there?
If Greece wasn't going to leave the euro with the 27% unemployment and a depression-level slump, who's going to leave? I think it's very, very hard. People just don't want to do that, even when the economics of it makes a lot of sense.
We always said in Brussels, don't underestimate Angela Merkel's will to keep this thing together.
No, that's a really, really good point. Yet, there is an attraction to populism, right? People in Spain, people in France can't turn away from it completely. People in Germany with AfD's
that's right.
Strong showing.
Everybody's got their little Trumps. Everybody's got their and not necessarily in countries you would think. Germany. By the way, this is a demonstration that it's not. Economic anxiety is a very distinctly secondary thing. Germany has been the great success story of this whole period. Even so, they have a resurgent hard right.
Yes.
All right, well, we want to bring in some viewer questions to wrap it all up, to wrap up your hour with us. Joe, why don't you start with this one on the broken Phillips curve?
Oh, yeah, so questions about the Phillips curve. We talked about it a little bit earlier on. What do you make of it? Some wondering if it's the changing nature of the economy from a manufacturing to a service economy. Maybe it was never valid in the first place. What's your take on that debate?
Yeah, my take is that I don't really know. I mean, we're trying. Look, some things we can see. We can still see that there's an awful lot. If you look at the distribution of wage changes, there's a spike at zero, which tells us that one thing that's still going on is that there are still people who are really should, from a market sense, be taking wage cuts, and because they can't, there's kind of a pent-up demand for wage decline that's sitting there. Some of it may be that expectations that after years and years of inflation falling below forecasts, that is starting to get reflected in expectations. But I have to say, all of this stuff, I have a feeling that I'm like a pre-Copernican astronomer doing epicycles, trying to make this model that really doesn't want to fit. So the answer is, at some level, we don't know.
Pedro was asking if it's related to the transition mechanism, though. I guess in some sense, does it fall out in the wash at some point?
Oh, I don't think that I don't think that the service economy change or anything. In general, structural change is overrated, right? It's things like the fact that people obviously think it's easy to find jobs should be showing up in higher wage demands, and why it isn't showing up is still a puzzle.
Mystery.
Janet Yellen has said so as much. All right, final question to you. Will the Fed be successful in reducing its balance sheet?
Oh yeah, that is really not, the idea that there was ever going to be a big problem there was always a fundamental misunderstanding. They have plenty of tools to offset it. If they tried to dump it all at once, it'd be a big problem, but I don't see any problem there.
Wait, one last question. We just have a few seconds left. Years ago, you said that Bitcoin was evil, and it hasn't died yet. I'm curious what you think about these days, because so many conversations come back to that.
Yeah, I think it's still evil. I don't think that there's any very legitimate purpose for it. Yeah, it is kind of just it's suspended. I still think it's a Wile E. Coyote thing, right? You want to run off the edge of the cliff, and one day you look down and realize there's nothing under you, and but I've been saying that for years. I've been wrong all along.
In the meantime, the legs are moving really
Yes, that's
fast.
right.
All right. Paul Krugman, thank you so much. Thank you for spending the time with us. Nobel Prize winning economist. He's a columnist for the New York Times and, of course, a professor at the City University of New York.